So, under the 20th century and the Cold War, we're going to talk about three major military events. The first one being what happens in China as the communist movement takes place and takes root in China. And then the other two are when the United States gets involved using the containment policy to prevent that, or try to prevent the spread of communism into other countries. So to start with, we're going to talk about the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Communist Revolution. It takes place between 1927 and 1950, so it's a pretty long series of events, and it focuses generally around two figures, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. And you'll notice here on your notes that we have two spellings of their names. If you can see here, you've got Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Zhixi, and Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong. That should be a T, actually. It should be Say-tong. Sorry about that. And that actually comes to play because of the nature of the Chinese writing system and how it gets translated into English, into the Latin letters that we use. And so when you see them in our class, you'll see them both ways. I can't speak to outside of our class how you're going to see them, but for now, just know that when you see them, you're going to see them both ways. So the situation in China is that you have a communist leader, Mao. They call him Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao, who is going to gain a lot of popular support for the communist movement within China. Mao Zedong is going to go up against the nationalists in China. These are the people who are going to support the democracy that had been instituted. So under World History 1, you talked about the dynastic cycle and the dynasty systems of China, and that has collapsed and was replaced by a democracy, and that's what Jiang Zhixi and the nationalists were promoting. So there's a lot of different series of events that are going to come into play, including the Cultural Revolution, where the communists are taking root and that sort of thing. But the sort of quick version is that the communists gain ground and the nationalists start falling back, and the nationalists are going to flee to the island of Taiwan. I have Taiwan on the map on the next slide, and I just need you to know that the Chinese form Modern China, which is the PRC, the People's Republic of China, whereas the nationalists in Taiwan are going to identify themselves as a free and independent China. Because of that, Taiwan and China are actually still at odds. So the PRC, the People's Republic of China, is what you see in purple, whereas orange with the capital of Taipei is the ROC. You can see Taiwan is also known as the Republic of China. The official international stance is that Taiwan is a part of the country of China and that it is an area in rebellion. Of course, the people of Taiwan believe that Taiwan is an independent country in and of itself. The power of the Chinese economy is going to actually require that we as an industrial world, not necessarily an industrial world, but as a united world, are going to view the Taiwanese land holdings the same way that the Chinese of Communist China do. It's also important to note that in the Korean War, which is coming up, I'm going to talk about that next, the Korean rebels are going to be supported by Communist China. So that brings me to just a very brief chat about Korea. So here's the Korean Peninsula on your map, right? It is the peninsula that sticks out between northern China and Japan. The archipelago of Japan is right here. That's Japan. That's a J. Sorry about that. I don't know why that got so crazy. Japan. Based on our concept of the domino theory, that we were trying to contain, that once one country fell to communism, the other countries around it would fall as well. That was happening in the Korean War because the North Korean communist rebels were there to, were being influenced and supported by the Chinese, and you can see the close proximity on where they have a shared border. We send American troops to fight in Korea in an effort to control the spread of communism, the containment policy. And ultimately, there's a stalemate and there's a law passed that divides Korea in half. You can see the white line there on your map. They are divided at the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. It's this area, it's a couple of miles wide and runs the length of their countries. That's a particular cordoned off area that divides the North and the South, where it's an international recognized border with troops stationed on either side. North Korean troops and South Korean troops facing each other. It has been since the 1950s. It roughly follows the 38th parallel, which was the original dividing point. But you can see the line itself is not like a perfect straight line, so it's not exactly the 38th parallel. But the DMZ is there as a buffer between North Korea and South Korea. And finally, we have the war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese were being controlled as a part of French imperialism. The French had taken it over as a protectorate in the 1700s and had been ruling it for 200 years. In the early 20th century, a man named Ho Chi Minh becomes a communist and begins speaking out against the policies of the French, namely the concept that the French were controlling Vietnam and he wanted Vietnamese control. He's a communist, but he's also a nationalist, which is a sharp contrast from the two sides of the Chinese Civil War that we talked about earlier. And he is going to support the Viet Cong, which are going to fight in Vietnam against the Americans and the French and a group of other people. This should say from 1954. Gosh, there's a lot of mistakes on this one. Sorry about that. It should say from 1954. The Vietnamese were a divided nation. They divided it in half between the North and the South, in the same way that North Korea is divided today from South Korea. And that was functioning for a while. And then we ultimately end up sending troops in to contain the spread of communism into Vietnam. If you go back to your map for just a second on the slide before that, you can see that just like the domino theory and how one would fall and the next would, you actually have here that they are border countries with China, just like North Korea was. So that's genuinely what we were concerned about. So ultimately, there's about 58,000 people who are killed in action. There are tons more who were marked as missing in action or were prisoners of war or what have you. And we reach a stalemate where we're not really gaining any ground in either of the Vietnamese. And so ultimately what we decide to do is we sign a peace agreement under President Nixon with the Vietnamese to keep Vietnam divided between North and South, where there would be a communist government in the North and a democratic free government in the South. Unfortunately for Vietnam, when the United States pulled its troops and withdrew, then the North Vietnamese communist rebels, or communist government at that point, took over the entire peninsula, or the entire country. It's not on a peninsula, where they're without the support of the international community. The South Vietnamese lose, and Vietnam is remaining in 2019 a communist country from north to south, united but still living under communism. All right. That's it. Make sure that you have filled in all your notes and answered all the questions. And if you have any questions, email me, send me my message, or ask me in class. Thanks.